Chapter 14, the autonomic nervous system. So we're going to use the ANS for the rest of this. It's the autonomic nervous system. So autonomic nervous system is part of the motor system. So as a reminder, when we're talking about autonomic nervous system, this is in the branch of the peripheral nervous system, and it consists of motor neurons that will innervate smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. The other motor system is the somatic nervous system, which does skeletal muscle. So we're doing autonomic, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. And this is really important for a lot of our homeostatic mechanisms with heart rate, blood pressure, and digestive processes. And what's interesting about the ANS is it is subconscious. It is not something that we think about. It is going to be involuntary. So that's what that term you will see a lot. So here's the branch that we are in right now, the autonomic nervous system. We're in the PNS, and then the PNS will have the sensory and the motor branch. The motor will have the skeletal muscle, the somatic, the autonomic nervous system where we're in, and we're going to spend most of our time talking about the two branches within the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So those are the two branches that most of what the chapter will focus on. So before we go into the dive of those two branches, some general ANS information. These are going to have motor fibers, but it will differ from the somatic nervous system in the effector, what output it is providing, where that pathway to the output and the ganglia, and then the neurotransmitters in that target organ. So to talk through this, I like to do this as a little chart. So we're going to do the differences between the somatic nervous system and ANS. So these differences, we're going to start with the effectors. Somatic and our autonomic. So the first way we're going to differ is going to be within our effectors. So your somatic nervous system, as we know, is going to be responsible for your skeletal muscle, whereas your ANS is going to be responsible for your cardiac muscle, your smooth muscle, so those are all three kinds of muscle, but then also your glands is going to be your ANS. So that's one way they differ. The next way they differ is going to be pathways and ganglia. So this is the first way they differ. The second way is going to be their pathways and their ganglia. So one thing to note as we're talking about pathways and ganglia is that there's going to be the motor neuron in the somatic nervous system is only going to be one motor neuron, or two motor neurons, or three motor neurons. So it could be a variety of different amounts. But with the somatic nervous system, it will have the motor neuron body, cell body, that's what we care about, will be in the CNS. And then axons will be in either the spinal or the cranial nerves. So basically with our somatic nervous system, our motor body is going to be in the CNS, with the axons and spinal going through the spinal or the cranial nerves. When we get to our ANS, it's going to be a little bit different. So this is always going to have a 2-neuron chain. So there will always be 2 neurons. So they'll call the first one a pre-ganglionic neuron, and then they'll call the second one a post-ganglionic neuron. So basically they're saying that the synapse in the middle is a pre. So here's my neuron, and then my dendrites will connect. Here's my post. So you're going to have number 1 and number 2. It's always going to be a 2-neuron chain. The pre-ganglionic fibers will have the cell body in the CNS. So it could be the brain or the spinal cord, whereas the post-ganglionic will have the cell body outside the CNS. So this is going to do both Preganglionic will be inside, postganglionic will be outside. And so then another difference between them is that's the ganglia, but the pathways are also going to be a little bit different. With our somatic nervous system, our effector up here is always going to be, as a reminder, that skeletal muscle. So that's the effector up here. But our pathways and our ganglia are leading to different effectors, cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands for our ANS. So when we're talking about these are preganglionic axons, so these guys right here, as they go and connect to their effector, these are going to be thin and non-myelinated. So there's no myelin on these guys. Or sorry, lightly myelinated. I got the wrong one. Lightly myelinated. Whereas the other one, or postganglionic, these axons will be thinner. Ooh, let's actually put that first. These axons will also be thin and they will be non-myelinated. So that is going to be the difference between these two guys as well. And then the third difference between them was going to be the neurotransmitter effects on their target organ. So when we're looking at our neurotransmitter effects, so we've got lots of different transmitters that we've talked about in previous chapters. So the first one, when we're talking about it with our somatic nervous system, neurotransmitter, that one is going to be, because it's going to be the same one. Our skeletal muscle is always going to be with our acetylcholine neurotransmitter. And what it will always do is it will always excite the muscle. So it is always going to stimulate. Your ANS is going to be slightly different. Your ANS will either excite or inhibit. It has the ability to do both options depending on where it is and what it is actually acting on. So within our somatic nervous system, it's always going to excite, and with our ANS, it could do either. But as a reminder, we're talking about our postganglionic because this is the one that will actually connect to your target organ or your effector. So our postganglionic with our ANS. Within the branch of our ANS system, you have the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic. So those are going to have two different. Sympathetic nervous system will use the neurotransmitter norepinephrine, whereas our parasympathetic nervous system will use ACH as well. So we're talking about the postganglionic release, and the sympathetic nervous system will be norepinephrine, and the parasympathetic nervous system will be ACH. And it can either excite or inhibit depending on what it acts on. So this is a great little review to show how this works. Keep in mind when you're looking at this that this is going to be two neurons. So there is always going to be one neuron and a second neuron, however that works. So just as a reminder, that is what you're looking for. Okay, so we briefly touched on this, but looking at the two divisions of the ANS, you've got the parasympathetic and the sympathetic. These are our two branches, and we're going to spend, like I said, most of the time talking about the difference. So within our parasympathetic, this is going to be the part of our autonomic nervous system that is going to be our maintenance mode. This is where we will just have our regular functions. We're going to conserve energy. We're just going to kind of do our normal. It's our maintenance mode. Whereas our sympathetic nervous system is we're actually going to create some sort of activity, and we're going to mobilize the body if we need to. So we're going to mobilize the body during some sort of activity. And our organs are actually served by both divisions. So these effectors are both skeletal, smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, or glands. But the divisions will have opposite effects. So it will turn on or it will turn off that effector. So the role of the parasympathetic nervous system is where we're going to go first. So sympathetic, which is our maintenance. This is also called rest and digest because it is not mobilizing the body for activity. This is where we are doing our normal everyday processes. It's our housekeeping. So examples of this is when you're relaxing and eating a meal, your blood pressure, your heart rate, respiratory rates are low. You don't need to have your heart rate elevated in order to digest your food. You need to have your heart rate elevated when you're working out. So that's some examples of the parasympathetic. It is rest and digest for that maintenance. Then you've got your sympathetic division. And so this is the body. This is also called fight or flight, which I'm sure we have all heard of. So fight or flight is going to be part of our sympathetic nervous system. We're going to be priming our body for activity, elevate our heart rate, get our body going, dilating our vessels, dilating our eyes, all of those pieces. Couple key differences between the two. So we talked about differences between the somatic and the autonomic nervous system. This is the differences between the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. So looking at these two, we're going to have three key differences between them. So we're going to let's do it this way. We're going to have our parasympathetic and then our sympathetic nervous system. And the way they're going to differ is one is going to be site or the origin, where they actually are going to start. So your parasympathetic are going to originate in the brain or the spinal cord. So they are considered craniosacral. So brain or spinal cord is where you'll find these, whereas your sympathetic will be thoracolumbar. So they're going to start in the thoracic and the lumbar region. So looking right here, here's our parasympathetic. So we've got them starting up here in our craniosacral region. You can see that there. And then within our sympathetic, we're in our thoracic section and lumbar section of our body. Also, the length of our axon or the length of the fibers is going to be different based on how far they need to go. We're going to remember we all are going to have the pre-ganglionic and the post-ganglionic because we're in the ANS. So there's always going to be two neuron chains. So the length of the fibers is different. In our parasympathetic nervous system, our pre-ganglionic fiber is going to be long. So he's traveling a far distance. Woo, there's our fiber. Let's do that in a different color. There's our fiber. And then he's going to synapse on our next neuron, whereas our post-ganglionic is going to be short. The opposite is true for our sympathetic nervous system. We're going to have a short pre-ganglionic and a long post-ganglionic. So that means the first one will look like this, and then he'll synapse, and then you'll have a long post-ganglionic. So that's the difference between the two, is the length of the fibers. Another difference between these two is the ganglia location and where you can find those. Your ganglia and your parasympathetic are going to be near the effector organ, which makes sense if we have a long preganglionic fiber and a short post-ganglionic fiber because our effector organ is right here. So this cell body will be close to our effector organ. That makes sense. In our sympathetic nervous system, your cell body or your ganglia will lie close to the spinal cord, which also makes sense because our first, up here, this first preganglionic cell is short because this is our effector organ, whereas this is our spinal cord. So that means our ganglia will be close to the spinal cord. So here's another good example of being able to compare those two. So now to dive a little bit deeper into each particular one, starting with just the parasympathetic. So we're going to do parasympathetic, we're going to do sympathetic, and then we're going to kind of talk about how the two relate. So within the parasympathetic division, as a reminder, this is the craniosacral division because the brain and spinal cord or the sacral regions of the spinal cord. And these are going to have long preganglionic, and we're going to synapse on a terminal ganglia that is close to the target organ. So we're going to have short postganglionic fibers. That's exactly what we just said previously. Again, here's another review. So we're going to break this down and we're going to do the cranial and then we're going to do the sacral part of both of these. So looking at the cranial division or the cranial part of the parasympathetic division. These cell bodies are located in the brain stem, so they are close to the brain and spinal cord. And these fibers can be found in the ocular motor, the facial nerve, and the glossopharyngeal nerves. So in nerve 3, cranial nerve 3, cranial 7, and cranial nerve 9. So basically, this will do the entire parasympathetic innervation of the head. So this is going to be controlling your muscles of your eyes, pupils, also going to be controlling the large glands in the head. So your lacrimal, your tear ducts, your nasal glands, your salivary glands, your submanual, all of those will be controlled by facial nerve 7 and 9. And then the last nerve that is controlled by the parasympathetic division is vagus nerve, so cranial nerve 10. This is actually 90% of all of your preganglionic parasympathetic fibers in your body. So this is what we meant when the vagus nerve, we said that it went to carried sensory and motor. So this is the motor side. And it was traveling to the abdomen, not the head or neck. So vagus nerve is not innervating the head or neck. These other three up here are. So it is serving the thoracic and the abdominal viscera. What's really important about these guys is that the vagus nerve, the parasympathetic motor output, has these three functions, which is very, very, very important. And basically, the cardiac plexus will enable your autonomic parasympathetic division to be able to slow your heart rate so that it can be controlled. Remember, parasympathetic is rest and digest. So we're not turning on, we're turning off. So cardiac plexus will slow your heart rate. Your pulmonary plexus, which is innervating your lung, is actually going to supply your lungs and your bronchiole. So it'll actually serve your lungs. And then you're going to have your esophageal plexus for your rest and digest system. And this will essentially turn on your stomach and your esophagus in this entire process of digestion. So that's really cool to have that part. That's the cranial part. Then they're also going to be the sacral part of the parasympathetic division. So just as a reminder, parasympathetic is craniosacral. So we're going to break those up. So this is the sacral part. It does originate from neurons S2 to S4. So it's very low. It's pelvic, in the pelvic region, and the distal half of your large intestines is what it will actually serve. And so this is really, really important because he will be responsible for connecting with ganglia in your pelvic floor, your intestines, your urinary bladder, ureters, and reproductive organs for both males and females. So your parasympathetic division will control those pieces. So here's a great example of layout to be able to see those. Okay, so now looking at our sympathetic division. So this is our fight or flight division. This is more complex because it's turning on more organs. So it's still going to be your smooth muscle, your cardiac muscle, and your sweat glands. Some of these structures are actually only innervated by sympathetic. So your sweat glands, your hair follicles, and smooth muscles of the blood vessels specifically are only innervated by the sympathetic nervous system. So he's also called the thoracocolumnar division because he is bringing the preganglionic fibers just from the center, the thorax, and the middle of the body. So the key anatomical differences between this preganglionic sympathetic nervous system, right here, you can see how it is going to innervate some of these same things, but it is going to turn on these processes. So what I really want to focus on is the 12 the 23 vertebral ganglia in the sympathetic trunk. Say that 5 times fast. So there's a lot of cell bodies. Remember, ganglia essentially means cell bodies. So there's a lot of these guys in just the sympathetic trunk. So coming off of your spinal cord all the way down in the thorax, in the thoracic and the lumbar region. I cannot talk today. We're actually going to be having lots of these rami and these connections. So going into the details of this, we are not going to dive in deep to the ganglia. It's just a little bit too complex, and I don't think your book does a fantastic job of really talking about it. So the pathways of the sympathetic intervention, we're not really going to talk about all the pathways. But what I do want you to be able to just know is that these sympathetic pathways will innervate skin and blood vessels of the head. They'll be able to dilate the muscles in the eyes. They're going to turn off nasal and salivary glands. They can innervate your smooth muscle and your eyelids, and they also will have a branch to the heart. So that's the sympathetic will connect to these places. You do not need to necessarily know the full-on pathway. These sympathetic pathways will also innervate the heart through the cardiac plexus. They'll innervate the thyroid gland, and then they'll also innervate the lungs and esophagus. So very similar to the parasympathetic, but they just will have a different output measure. So you can see these here, just the specific branches. We're not going to talk about how they branch here. You guys don't need to focus on that piece. So these pathways will synapse in what is called collateral ganglia. So again, we're not going to spend a lot of time focusing on these collateral ganglia, but this sympathetic nervous system from T5 to L2 will synapse in something called collateral ganglia outside of the trunk, and it'll form a bunch of nerves. And basically, if this is our brain and our spinal cord, we're going to have a lot of nerves coming off of this that are going to come together, form a ganglia outside, and then we're going to form a lot of sympathetic nerves for these guys. So these are the 3 primary, the splenic nerves, the greater, lesser, or least, the lumbar, and then the sacral. So beyond knowing that those exist, how they all are going to innervate is not the focus of where I'm going to place emphasis on this exam. So our sympathetic nervous system does synapse with the adrenal medulla. So that's really, really, really important. Sorry, not synapsing. It will pass directly through the adrenal medulla without synapsing. But that is a very important piece of how our body is working, because your medulla is actually going to secrete norepinephrine and epinephrine. So norepinephrine is actually going to be the technical term for noradrenaline, which is probably not the most common, but epinephrine, which is actually what is found in rescue meds for allergy reactions, is going to be adrenaline. So that's the other term that this means. So norepinephrine and epinephrine, noradrenaline and adrenaline. So this should actually be adrenaline. Those are the 2 terms, or those are the 2 hormones that are released by the adrenal gland. So it's important to note that our sympathetic nervous system will travel through the adrenal gland and will actually get this epinephrine, this adrenaline, when we need to be in that fight or flight state. So that is important to note how that connection occurs. How that connection occurs, you do not need to focus on that. So that's the beginning part of chapter 14. The next part of chapter 14 is going to focus on visceral sensory neurons. So visceral sensory neurons are going to be sending information about changes in chemical, stretch, temperature, and any kind of irritation from the viscera. So this is very similar to the sensory neurons that we talked about in the skin when we were talking about those in chapter 12. However, these are specific from inside our body, the viscera. So these are also free nerve endings that are widely distributed all throughout our internal organs. These cell bodies are located in the dorsal root ganglia, so it's outside the CNS, and in the sensory ganglia of your cranial nerves. So again, it's outside the CNS for these guys. But these axons are going to travel the same way as the autonomic motor fibers. So they're still going to do the same thing and be able to serve our autonomic nervous system organs. So this is kind of an interesting because these are the things that play a role in that referred pain. So if you feel like you have an appendix, you'll feel it on the left side if there's an issue with your appendix, but your appendix is actually located on the right side of the body. So these visceral sensory neurons will help play a role in that internal referred pain. So there's something called a visceral reflex with these organs. So a visceral reflex is very similar to the skeletal muscle reflexes that we talked about in previous chapters. So they're going to have the same 5 components as the somatic reflex. They're going to have a receptor, integration center, motor neuron, and effector. So they will have the exact same 5 components, but there are 3 main differences. The first difference between a visceral reflex and our somatic reflex is going to be that the visceral reflex will have 2 neurons when we get to the motor pathway. So that means when we have the process of receptor that will do the sensory, that sensory neuron go the integration center. That integration center will send the motor neuron. So this should look familiar. And then that motor neuron turns on the effector. The process is the same, but what we're basically saying is this part right here will have 2 neurons. It will have 2 connections because remember our ANS will always have a preganglionic and a postganglionic. So there's going to be 2 differences there. Those 2 guys. Another difference between the somatic reflex arc and a visceral reflex arc is your afferent fibers are actually going to be called visceral sensory neurons. So that's just a slight difference between the 2. And then the third one is something we already know, so I'm not going to write it down, is that the effector of your visceral reflex arc is not going to be skeletal muscle. It is going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So that is the difference between the 2. The 3 differences between the 2 is whatever that effector is going to be. So an example of a visceral reflex, these are the things that will empty your rectum or empty your bladder. It is involuntary. You don't necessarily really think about this process. It does need to happen, but it is a receptor, sensory neuron. You're feeling full. Your integration center, you need to know what to do. Your motor neuron will have those 2-step sequence, and your effector, it will act on your smooth muscle in your bowels and your smooth muscle in your bladder in order to release those. So a 3-neuron reflex arc will actually exist in your GI tract, and this is a really big, important area of research right now. If there's any interest in leaky gut syndrome or IBS, it's this enteric nervous system, which is made up of sensory neurons, interneurons, and motor neurons. That is what is responsible for your GI tract visceral sensory reception. So again, it's got the same 5-step process. It's just going to be a little bit different in a couple different ways. Okay, so now the one of the most important parts of this chapter is going to be looking at the differences between the neurotransmitters in this system. So within our ANS, there's actually going to be different neurotransmitters that will do different things. So looking at our neurotransmitters, the major one of the ANS is acetylcholine, but also norepinephrine. So these are the 2 we're going to talk about the most. We're going to have our acetylcholine and our norepinephrine is what those stand for. So this is going to be a little bit tricky. We're going to actually do some more terminologies. So if there is a fiber or a axon that releases ACH as the neurotransmitter, it is going to be called a cholinergic fiber. ACH, acetylcholine, if the axon releases it, is called a cholinergic fiber. If you have a fiber, for these guys, a cholinergic fiber, this is going to be all of our preganglionic axons. All preganglionic axons in ANS will release our ACH. So we mentioned that earlier when we said the preganglionic releases something different than the postganglionic. All preganglionic, sympathetic and parasympathetic, all release ACH. So that is important. But in addition to all preganglionic, this one will also be released by parasympathetic postganglionic. Will release ACH. So within our system, that is something that, don't get these terms confused. All preganglionic, so all first neurons in the chain, will release ACH. But in the parasympathetic, the first and then the second will also. So just to draw that out a little bit differently, to look at that right here, here's our parasympathetic. We're going to release ACH here. That's the first preganglionic. In our sympathetic preganglionic, we're also going to release ACH. But it's only our parasympathetic that will release ACH for the pre and post ganglionic. So that's the difference there. If we have a fiber, so sorry. If there's a fiber that releases norepinephrine, then that is actually going to be called a different type of fiber, and that is called an adrenergic fiber. So different. We've got cholinergic and adrenergic fiber. This is actually only going to be this guy right here. So it's going to be most, always, but most sympathetic post-ganglionic. So the second, it's going to be the second in the sympathetic chain. This here will release this noradrenaline or norepinephrine fiber. So now we're going to talk about cholinergic fibers, and then we're going to talk about adrenergic fibers. So our cholinergic fiber, to start with, it's the cholinergic preganglionic cell releases ACH. But then on the postganglionic, there's going to be the receptor. So the cholinergic receptor is the postganglionic cell that is receiving this information. It could also be the parasympathetic effector gland, but there's two types of cholinergic receptors that will actually bind and select ACH. So you will have a nicotinic receptor, and then you're going to have a muscarinic receptor. These are the two receptors that accept ACH. And they are actually named after the drugs that we can artificially use to mimic this receptor. So nicotine from tobacco, from smoking, can actually bind to these receptors and mimic it. So we've named this the nicotinic receptor. And then muscarine is actually a poison that is produced from mushroom. And when that is introduced to the system, it will bind to these receptors. So it's called a muscarinic receptor. So that's just interesting how science and real life has kind of merged. So starting with our nicotinic receptors. Nicotinic, whenever you think that, just automatically think ACH. Nicotinic receptor. These are found on all postganglionic neurons, because remember, all postganglionic neurons is the second neuron That's this guy right here. All of these are connected to the preganglionic, and the preganglionic is releasing ACH. So a cholinergic receptor is found on all postganglionic neurons, whether or not it's sympathetic or parasympathetic. And what this is really important for is it is also going to be found on adrenal medulla hormone producing cells and, as we know, the neuromuscular junction in skeletal muscle. The effects of your nicotinic, so your nicotinic receptors, the effect is always going to be excitatory. It will always stimulate. So a nicotinic receptor that receives ACH will always excite the cell. So it'll open up the channel, will depolarize. So when we say excite, we do mean depolarize everything into perspective. And then you're going to have a muscarinic. Remember, whenever you hear muscarinic, you need to also think that it is receiving ACH. So these are only going to be found on effector cells that are stimulated by postganglionic cholinergic fibers. So this muscarinic receptors is going to be on the effector cell. So those are going to be found on this guy, because this is the postganglionic fiber that is releasing it. So it is the effector organ here that is receiving that. So that is where the only place you're going to find the muscarinic is on the postganglionic effector cell. Whenever you have this muscarinic, it can either be excitatory or inhibitory. So that's a little bit different. Whereas up here, we had always excitatory. With your muscarinic receptors, it is not always excitatory. It can actually be either excitatory or inhibitory. It depends on what it is actually connecting to. So this will depend on the effector gland or the target organ. Excitatory will turn on or depolarize that membrane. If it's an inhibitory, it will actually hyperpolarize the membrane, so it doesn't turn on. An example of this is you have ACH and cardiac muscle cells. It will slow your heart rate for cardiac muscle. However, if you put it on smooth muscle, it increases. So it can excite your ACH will excite smooth muscle. ACH will slow your heart muscle. This is super important, especially if you guys want to do any kind of nursing. Receptors for the autonomic nervous system are a big deal. Let's say you have a patient on the table in front of you and they have a slow heart rate. If they have a slow heart rate, what is the last thing in the world you want to give them? You do not want to give them any sort of ACH. Because what does ACH do? Slow the heart rate. So you do not want to give them anything that will stimulate acetylcholine receptors in order to turn and make that heart rate even slower. Okay, moving on to the next one, we're going to have our adrenergic receptors. So our adrenergic receptors, there's two major classes for these guys. So these are the ones that respond to norepinephrine, or they will respond to epinephrine. So they actually respond to either. They're going to be divided into, these adrenergic are not as complicated, and they're divided into two. You will either have the alpha receptor or you will have the beta receptor. And depending on where it is, it will respond to either norepinephrine or epinephrine, and it will be either excitatory or inhibitory. So depending on the target organ, it will be both excitatory on one organ, but it can be inhibitory on another organ. So this also kind of falls into the effects depend on the target organ. So using that heart rate example up here, if you have norepinephrine binding to cardiac muscle, it will increase the heart rate. But if you do epinephrine on the bronchial tubes, it will actually relax the bronchial tubes. So it'll inhibit those. So if we were to give someone with a slow heart rate, knowing which one to give them, either norepinephrine or epinephrine or acetylcholine, will be super, super, super important. So with this adrenergic receptors, it can be excitatory or inhibitory. So just to write it out, if we have norepinephrine and we connect that norepinephrine to cardiac muscle, so we have that cardiac muscle and we put our norepinephrine on it, we're going to increase our heart rate, or we're going to increase. But if we have epinephrine and we do the smooth muscle of our lungs or our bronchioles, it will actually relax. It will decrease the contraction. This is kind of how you can see norepinephrine will increase the contraction in your heart rate, whereas up here, acetylcholine will decrease. That is how they work. And that you don't need to focus on the drug classes. If you go into anything nursing, you will get more than enough of that in that class. So another takeaway from this is how the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system interact with each other. So most visceral organs have something called dual intervention, which means that they will have both the para and the sympathetic innervating them. So they will have both parasympathetic and sympathetic axons connecting to them. So when the action potential travels down both divisions, it will produce what is called an antagonistic interaction. So it will essentially do both effects at the same time. It will turn on and it will turn off. However, one division you will usually predominate. It will take over. But in some cases, it will actually have a cooperative effect. So here's some examples of antagonistic interactions. So this basically is going to be where you have the two systems working at the same time, doing opposite things. So within your sympathetic division of your nervous system, of your ANS, your sympathetic, it will increase your rate, and it will increase and it will decrease digestion. Whereas in your parasympathetic system, what it will actually do is it will decrease your heart rate and your respiratory rate, and it will increase your digestion. This is the primary reason why they are called rest and digest, because we're going to increase digestion, and fight or flight. We're going to increase our heart rate and get our body ready to do something. So parasympathetic and sympathetic have antagonistic interactions. But what's interesting about that antagonistic interactions is all of our blood vessels will have smooth muscle inside them in order to innervate the constriction of our blood vessels, which is called tone. Blood vessel smooth muscle will have something called vasomotor tone, which essentially keeps our blood vessels in a partially constricted. It's not super relaxed, and it's not super closed. So when we're looking at our blood vessels, we are going to have a hollow spot in the middle where we'll have our blood flowing through that. That's our lumen. You'll learn about that in chapter or in second part of the course. And then you're going to have this middle layer, which is going to be all smooth muscle. And that smooth muscle will actually allow for this to grow and expand depending on what it needs to do. So it can be, here's one blood vessel. Here is it, let's do it bigger. Here is it where we've got our lumen expanded. We have dilated. We've contracted. Or we can do the opposite with our blood vessel and we can constrict. If we do this one, essentially what we're saying is that it lies in the middle. It is neither fully dilated nor fully constricted. It's partially. And that is going to be controlled by the sympathetic nervous system. So this whole process where we get blood flow based on our activity level delivered to certain organs of our body is also going to be controlled by your sympathetic tone. Your parasympathetic will usually dominate your heart and your smooth muscles, not your blood vessels. Also your digestive and your urinary tract. So it will pretty much do the other types of glands and smooth muscle. So that's a different kind of effect on those two different types of muscles. Sometimes we're going to have a cooperative effect between the two. And if that's the case, that will occur during erectile moments and will also occur for both male and female with ejaculation of semen in males and the reflex contractions in females. So that's when the two systems actually will work together is during those events. So then the last thing is there are some things that are unique to the sympathetic division only. So these are not parasympathetic. It is only going to be controlled by the sympathetic. And that is our adrenal medulla, sweat glands, the muscles, erector pili that are actually around your hair follicles, your kidneys, and almost all of your blood vessels are only going to get sympathetic fibers. And the reason is your sympathetic system will control some unique processes. So your sympathetic division or system will control your blood pressure. That is only controlled by your sympathetic nervous system. And it will control that blood pressure. When you have a low blood pressure, it will increase your sympathetic system. Your blood vessels will constrict. You increase your blood pressure, sympathetic firing, your vessels will dilate. So it is going to be this cycle that will circle. It also is going to regulate body heat. Your sympathetic nervous system is responsible for regulating your body's temperature or your body's heat. And this is the thermoregulatory responses to heat. When your temperature rises, your sympathetic nerve will dilate your blood vessels, allowing heat to escape, activating your sweat glands. We talked about that in the homeostatic mechanism in chapter 1. So this is the division that is controlling that sympathetic division. When you increase your body temperature, you will end up decreasing your body temperature, and you do that because you are going to sweat, because your sympathetic division is dilating your blood vessels. Another part of our sympathetic system that is unique is kidney function. So releasing renin from the kidneys is only going to be part of the sympathetic nervous system because that also will relate to blood pressure. So that goes together. And then our kidney function of our blood pressure. So that's kind of how it controls that. And then it is also going to be metabolic effects. So your sympathetic nervous system is going to be responsible for increasing the metabolic rate of your cells, which will raise blood glucose levels and mobilizes fats for use as fuels. So your metabolic system, the ability to use your fat in order to burn off your fat, in order to create that energy that we've talked about previously in this course, is controlled by your sympathetic division. So all of your metabolic components of your cell is controlled by this division. Okay, we are not going to focus on localized versus diffuse, and I will not be asking for any of these specific details regarding these. But when we get to the ANS, just as a reminder, the ANS is control of the CNS because we do have connections to the brainstem, spinal cord, hypothalamus, and the cerebral cortex. So when we talked about the hypothalamus, we said it was the main homeostatic center in the body? Well, mainly it's because it is responsible for connecting to the autonomic, so both parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. Beyond which one controls that, we're not going to go into the different levels of control for those. So that is the focus, and I actually am not going to ask any questions on disorders of the autonomic nervous system. Feel free to read, but I will not be asking any questions around that. So that is the end of chapter 14. The focus really is on the branches of the autonomic nervous system, somatic and parasympathetic, the neurotransmitters, the difference on how they affect, the differences between the autonomic and somatic nervous system, and pretty much comparing and contrasting all of the divisions is the focus for chapter 14.